April 18, 1945. 0521 hours. Okinawa, Shuri Line. Private First Class Daniel Moss crouched in a coral trench and watched a white cloud bloom across the hillside 300 yards away. It wasn't smoke. It was thicker, brighter, alive. It rolled and twisted like something breathing, and inside it he could hear screaming, not the sharp, sudden screams of men hit by bullets or shrapnel. These were longer, desperate, the kind that didn't stop. Moss had been in combat for 4 months. He'd seen men die a dozen different ways, but he'd never heard anything like this. His squad leader, Sergeant Halford, tapped his shoulder and pointed. "That's what we're firing today." Moss looked down at the bazooka round Halford had just handed him. It was marked with white stenciling, WP, White Phosphorus. Moss had heard rumors. Now, he was holding one. Halford's face was grim. "You load it, I'll fire it. And God, help whoever's on the other end." The weapon system that produced that white cloud was not supposed to exist. Not officially. The M9A1 bazooka, the standard American shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher, was designed to fire high-explosive anti-tank rounds. Heat rounds. Shaped charges meant to punch through armor plate, disable engines, kill tank crews. The idea was simple. Infantry needed a portable weapon that could stop German panzers or Japanese tanks without lugging around a 37mm anti-tank gun. The bazooka solved that problem. By 1945, it had become standard issue in every rifle company, every weapons platoon, every tank hunting squad in the Pacific and European theaters. But the war in the Pacific wasn't a tank war. The Japanese didn't deploy armor in large numbers. Most of their tanks were light, thin-skinned, vulnerable to rifle grenades or satchel charges. What the Japanese did deploy, what they deployed with brutal effectiveness, were fortifications, caves, pillboxes, bunkers carved into coral and reinforced with coconut logs and steel rails. Positions that could absorb artillery fire, withstand naval bombardment, and keep fighting. Positions that chewed up Marine and Army infantry in grinding, yard-by-yard advances that turned islands into graveyards. The bazooka's heat rounds could crack open a bunker entrance, kill anyone standing directly behind the blast. But they didn't clear the position, didn't neutralize it. The Japanese would pull back, wait for the smoke to clear, and resume firing. Over and over. The Americans needed something that didn't just damage fortifications. They needed something that made them uninhabitable. White phosphorus had been used in warfare since World War I. It ignited on contact with air, burned at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and produced thick white smoke that obscured vision and choked lungs. Artillery units fired WP shells for smoke screens and incendiary effects. Mortar teams used WP rounds to mark targets or burn out Japanese positions in jungle terrain. The substance was legal under international law as long as it was used for obscuration or signaling. But everyone knew what it really did. It burned. It burned through cloth, through skin, through bone. It couldn't be extinguished with water. Smothering it required dirt or sand, and even then fragments could reignite hours later when exposed to air again. Soldiers hit by white phosphorus didn't just die. They burned alive, slowly, screaming until their lungs gave out. It was a terror weapon. And by early 1945, someone in the Ordnance Department decided to see if it could be delivered by bazooka. The official designation was M10A1 White Phosphorus rocket. It was a standard M6A3 rocket body fitted with a WP burster charge instead of a shaped charge warhead. The idea was to create a dual-purpose round, obscuration and incendiary effect in a man-portable system. In theory, it would allow infantry squads to lay down smoke screens without waiting for mortar or artillery support. In practice, it became something else entirely. The M10A1 was tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in January 1945. Results were described as effective for smoke generation and highly destructive against personnel in enclosed spaces. The white phosphorus dispersed in a rapidly expanding cloud that filled bunkers, trenches, and cave systems, igniting anything flammable and causing severe chemical burns to anyone caught inside. Survivors, test observers noted, displayed extreme psychological distress even when physically unharmed. The recommendation was cautious, approved for limited issue, primarily for smoke and obscuration. Use against personnel should be incidental to primary tactical purpose. Translation: don't advertise it, but don't stop it either. By March 1945, M10A1 rounds were being shipped to forward units in the Pacific, packaged alongside standard heat rounds with minimal documentation. No special training, no technical bulletins, just white stencil markings and a brief note. WP, smoke, and incendiary. The first recorded combat use occurred on Iwo Jima, late February 1945. A Marine bazooka team, pinned down by fire from a cave entrance on the northern edge of the island, fired an M10A1 round into the opening. The white cloud erupted instantly, pouring into the cave and rolling back out in thick, choking billows. The firing stopped. Marines moved forward and found 17 Japanese soldiers dead inside, their bodies burned and their lungs seared by superheated air and chemical particulates. The cave was blackened, still smoldering. One Marine, a corporal named Dietrich, later described it in a letter home. It was like someone opened a door to hell and shoved them all inside. The bazooka team reported the round as highly effective. Within a week, every weapons platoon in the 3rd Marine Division was requesting WP rounds. Not for smoke, for killing. Word spread fast. Other units heard about it, requested it. By the time the Marines landed on Okinawa in April, M10A1 rounds were standard issue for bazooka teams tasked with bunker reduction. Nobody called them smoke rounds anymore. They called them Willie Peter, or burnout rounds, or, when they were being honest, terror rounds. Moss had arrived on Okinawa with the 96th Infantry Division on April 1st. The landing had been unopposed, an eerie, quiet walk on the beach that felt wrong from the start. The Japanese weren't defending the beaches. They were wading inland, dug into the ridges and hills that formed the Shuri Line, a defensive system so deeply fortified that even sustained naval gunfire barely scratched it. For 2 weeks, Moss's regiment advanced slowly, taking casualties from positions they couldn't see, couldn't suppress, couldn't destroy. Every ridgeline had caves. Every cave had machine guns. Every assault turned into a bloodbath. Standard tactics: riflemen suppress. Engineers moved forward with satchel charges or flamethrowers, worked but slowly and at horrific cost. Flamethrower operators had a life expectancy measured in minutes. Engineers hauling satchel charges got cut down before they reached the target. The Japanese didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They fought from prepared positions until they were killed or the position was destroyed. And there were hundreds of positions, thousands. The advance stalled. Casualties mounted. Moss had seen 3 men in a squad killed in 10 days. All of them shot by machine guns firing from cave mouths they couldn't reach, couldn't silence. He was exhausted, terrified, and angry. On April 18th, Moss's platoon was tasked with reducing a fortified ridge overlooking the village of Kakazu. Intelligence estimated 12 to 15 defensive positions along a 600-yard frontage, mutually supporting, with interlocking fields of fire. Previous assaults had failed. Casualties had been severe. The new plan involved concentrated artillery, air support, and infantry assault with enhanced bunker reduction capability. That meant bazookas, lots of them. And for the first time, Moss's squad was issued M10A1 rounds. For a round per team, Halford, the squad leader, gave a brief explanation. These are white phosphorus. You fire them into a cave or bunker. The stuff ignites, fills the space, burns everything inside. It also makes smoke, lots of it. So don't stand downwind. You load, I fire. We don't talk about it afterward. Clear. Moss looked at the round. It felt the same as a heat round. Weighed the same. But the stenciling was different, and Halford's tone was different. Moss asked, "Is this legal?" Halford stared at him. "It's a smoke round. Officially. Anything else is incidental. Now quit asking questions and get your gear." The assault began at 0510 hours with 30-minute artillery barrage. Moss crouched in the trench, helmet pressed against coral, as shells screamed overhead and detonated on the ridge. The noise was overwhelming. The ground shook. Dust and smoke filled the air. At 0540, the barrage lifted and the platoon moved forward, advancing in small groups under covering fire from machine gun teams positioned behind. Moss carried the bazooka rounds in a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Halford carried the launcher. They moved slowly, using every fold of ground for cover, staying low. Japanese machine gun fire started almost immediately. Long, disciplined bursts from positions that had survived the artillery. Men went down. Moss heard shouting, saw medics running forward. The platoon's momentum stalled. They were pinned, taking fire from at least 3 separate positions. Moss and Halford crawled into a shell crater, breathing hard. Halford scanned the ridge, then pointed. There, cave entrance. 200 yards, 11 o'clock. Moss saw it, a dark opening in the coral, partially concealed by vegetation, muzzle flashes strobing from inside. That was the gun killing them. Halford assembled the bazooka, locked the tube onto the shoulder rest. Load heat. Moss pulled a standard round, armed it, slid it into the tube. Halford aimed, fired. The rocket streaked upward, hit just left of the cave mouth, detonated in a flash of orange. Smoke, dust. The machine gun kept firing. Halford swore. Load WP. Moss hesitated. Halford turned. Load it. Now! Moss pulled the M10A1 round from a bag. It looked the same, felt the same, but the white stenciling felt like a warning. He armed it, loaded it, tapped Halford's shoulder. Halford aimed, adjusted for drop, and fired. The rocket streaked across the open ground and disappeared into the cave entrance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the white cloud erupted. It didn't pour out slowly. It exploded outward in a rolling, expanding mass that looked solid, like something alive. It filled the cave mouth, spilled over the edges, drifted down the slope in thick coils. And the screaming started, high-pitched, frantic, inhuman. Moss saw a movement inside the cloud, shapes stumbling, flailing. One figure emerged from the cave, on fire, clothes burning, arms swinging wildly. He made it 3 steps before collapsing. The screaming continued for 20 seconds. 30, then stopped. The white cloud kept rolling, drifting across the ridge, and the machine gun was silent. Halford lowered the bazooka. His hands were shaking. Moss stared at the cave. The platoon moved forward. The effect of the M10A1 round was immediate and total. The White Phosphorus had ignited everything inside the cave: ammunition, fuel, supplies, and men. The heat had been so intense that the rock walls were scorched black. Bodies were barely recognizable, burned beyond identification. The smell was unbearable: chemicals, burning flesh, charred stone. Moss made himself look. He needed to understand what he'd just been part of. One of the Japanese soldiers had been carrying a photograph. It was half-burned, curled at the edges, but the image was still visible. A woman and 2 children, smiling. Moss turned away. He wanted to throw up. He didn't. He just kept moving. That was the first time Moss loaded a WP round. It wouldn't be the last. Over the next 3 weeks, his squad used M10A1 rounds 17 more times. Every cave, every bunker, every fortified position that couldn't be taken with grenades or satchel charges. The results were always the same. White cloud, screaming, silence. The positions were neutralized. The advance continued. Casualties dropped. The tactic worked. But it stayed with him. Every time he loaded a round, every time Halford fired, every time the cloud erupted, Moss felt something inside him break a little more. The Japanese soldiers on Okinawa had a name for it: Shuri, White Death. Reports from captured Japanese soldiers and interrogated officers described the weapon as the most feared American tactic on the island, more terrifying than flamethrowers, more devastating than artillery. One captured lieutenant, interrogated in early May, stated through a translator, "When the white cloud comes, men do not fight. They run. If they cannot run, they die screaming. There is no defense. No courage helps. It is not a soldier's death. It is burning alive." Another report, filed by a Japanese medical officer found in a captured field hospital, described treating soldiers exposed to white phosphorus. Burns covered entire body surfaces. Eyes seared shut. Lungs damaged by inhalation. Infection rates were catastrophic. Survival rates were low. The officer wrote, "This weapon does not kill quickly. It kills slowly, painfully, without mercy. It destroys morale before it destroys the body. Men would rather face artillery than face the white cloud." The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate target. Entire defensive positions would abandon their posts after witnessing a WP strike on a nearby bunker. Japanese soldiers, known for their discipline and willingness to fight to the death, broke and fled when the white smoke appeared. The weapon didn't just kill defenders. It shattered the will to defend. American commanders noticed. By late April, the use of M10A1 rounds had become standard procedure in bunker reduction operations across the Okinawa front. Bazooka teams were specifically tasked with WP strikes as part of coordinated assaults. The results were undeniable. Positions that would have taken hours to reduce, costing dozens of casualties, were neutralized in minutes with minimal friendly losses. The operational advantage was enormous, but the ethical questions were growing. Chaplains attached to frontline units began reporting increased psychological stress among soldiers using WP rounds. Men who had handled combat stress reasonably well were now showing signs of severe trauma, nightmares, guilt, refusal to fire. One chaplain, Captain Morris, filed a report in May describing conversation with a bazooka operator who'd used WP rounds in 12 separate engagements. The soldier had asked, "Am I going to hell for this?" Morris didn't have an answer. He forwarded the question to higher command. It was never answered. Officially, the M10A1 was a smoke round. Its use against personnel was incidental. There were no war crimes, no violations of international law, no ethical breaches, just effective tactics in a brutal war. But the men on the ground knew what they were doing, and some of them struggled with it. Moss was one of them. After the first week, he'd stopped thinking about it during the day. He loaded rounds. Halford fired them. The positions burned, and they moved forward. It was mechanical, necessary. But at night, alone in his foxhole, he couldn't stop seeing the shapes stumbling out of smoke. The bodies burned black. The photograph in the dead soldier's pocket. He tried to justify it. The Japanese were dug in. They wouldn't surrender. Every day they held a position, more Americans died. Using WP saved American lives. That was the argument. That was the logic. And it was true, but it didn't make the screaming stop in his memory. It didn't make the smell go away. Moss wasn't alone. Other men in the platoon were struggling. A rifleman named Casey started refusing to advance after WP strikes, saying he couldn't stand the smell. Another soldier, a corporal named Lynn, requested transfer out of the weapons squad. Both requests were denied. There were no transfers. There was only the line, the advance, the mission. The Shuri Line had to be broken, whatever it took. By mid-May, the Japanese defenses were collapsing, not because of WP rounds alone. The cumulative effect of naval gunfire, air strikes, artillery, flamethrowers, and relentless infantry pressure had ground down their ability to resist. But the WP rounds had accelerated the process. Positions that should have held for days fell in hours. Entire ridge systems were abandoned after a handful of WP strikes. The Japanese command structure was breaking down. Communication lines were severed, and morale, always a Japanese strength, was shattered. On May 21st, Moss's regiment captured a Japanese command post in a cave complex near Shuri Castle. Inside, they found documents, maps, orders, intelligence reports. One report, translated later, described American tactics and included a section on the white burning weapon. The report recommended immediate evacuation of any position targeted by the weapon, stating that defense was impossible and casualties were unacceptable. It was a stunning admission from an army that had, until this point, ordered soldiers to fight to the death in every position. The White Phosphorus bazooka rounds had done what nothing else could. They'd made the Japanese afraid. But the cost wasn't just measured in enemy casualties. Moss's platoon had started the Okinawa campaign with 42 men. By late May, after 7 weeks of combat, 18 were dead, 12 were wounded and evacuated, and the remaining 12, including Moss, were physically and psychologically shattered. Moss had lost 20 pounds. He couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. His hands shook when he loaded rounds. Halford, the squad leader who'd fired every WP round, barely spoke anymore. He did his job, aimed, fired, moved, but his eyes were empty. Other soldiers called it the 1,000-yard stare. Moss called it what it was, the look of a man who'd seen too much and done too much and couldn't reconcile it. They weren't the only ones. Across the entire Okinawa campaign, psychological casualties were staggering. Combat fatigue rates were higher than any previous Pacific battle. Soldiers who'd fought on Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, veteran troops who'd seen the worst of the war, were breaking down, and the weapons they were using, flamethrowers, WP rounds, satchel charges, close-quarters killing, were part of the reason. This wasn't war at a distance. This was intimate, personal, and it left scars that didn't show on casualty lists. The ethical debate about white phosphorus continued after the war, but quietly, in classified reports and academic papers, not in public discourse. The official Army position remained unchanged. WP was a smoke and obscuration agent. Its use against personnel was legal under international law because it was not employed as a primary anti-personnel weapon. The fact that it killed and maimed was incidental to its tactical purpose. Legal scholars debated this. Some argued that any weapon used primarily to inflict suffering, regardless of its official designation, violated the spirit of the laws of war. Others countered that in total war, particularly against an enemy that refused surrender and employed equally brutal tactics, such distinctions were meaningless. The debate never reached a conclusion. White phosphorus remained in the arsenal. The M10A1 rounds were eventually phased out, replaced by more modern delivery systems, but the substance itself and the tactics developed on Okinawa became standard. WP artillery rounds, mortar rounds, grenades, all of them used in Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. The weapon that Japanese soldiers called White Death never went away. It just became normal. Moss survived Okinawa. The island was declared secure on June 21st, 1945, after 82 days of fighting. Moss's regiment was pulled off the line, sent to a rest area, and told they'd be part of the invasion of Japan. He didn't believe he'd survive that. Nobody did. The casualty projections were nightmarish. Hundreds of thousands of American dead, millions of Japanese. The invasion was expected to last years. But it never happened. In early August, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Moss went home. He didn't talk about Okinawa, didn't talk about the bazooka, didn't talk about the WP rounds or the white clouds or the screaming. His family asked questions. He gave short answers. He got a job, got married, had kids, lived a quiet life in Pennsylvania. But the war stayed with him. He had nightmares for decades, always the same. The white cloud, the shape stumbling, the photograph. In 1982, at a veterans reunion, he met Halford for the first time since 1945. They recognized each other immediately. Didn't say much, just shook hands. Later, sitting alone with a beer, Halford asked, "You ever think about it?" Moss nodded. "Every day." Halford looked away. "Me too." They didn't talk about it again. There was nothing to say. They'd done what they'd been ordered to do. They'd survived, and they carried it. The broader story of the M10A1 WP round is mostly forgotten. It doesn't appear in popular histories of World War II. It's not featured in documentaries or museum exhibits. Most people who know about white phosphorus think of it as an artillery weapon, not something fired from a bazooka. The truth is buried in after-action reports, casualty studies, and the memories of men who are almost all gone now. But the impact was real. For a few months in 1945, on a blood-soaked island in the Pacific, American forces deployed a weapon that terrified the enemy, accelerated the collapse of fanatical defense, and saved countless American lives. It also scarred the men who used it, forced ethical questions that were never answered, and introduced a level of brutality that even a brutal war struggled to justify. Was it necessary? Probably. Was it right? That depends on who you ask. The soldiers who loaded and fired the rounds carry one answer. The soldiers whose lives were saved carry another. And the men who burned alive in the caves carry a third, though they're not here to speak it. The final irony of the M10A1 story is this. The weapon was so effective, so devastating in its tactical application, that it was quietly removed from service after the war, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Military planners recognized that White Phosphorus, delivered in a man-portable system, was too indiscriminate, too horrific in its effects, and too psychologically damaging to both enemy and friendly forces. It blurred the line between legitimate military force and terror weapon. In an era where the U.S. was trying to position itself as a moral leader in the post-war world, continuing to deploy WP bazooka rounds was politically and ethically untenable. So the rounds were phased out. The tactic was quietly retired. The men who'd used them were never acknowledged. No medals, no commendations, no official recognition, just silence. And for the veterans, that silence was both a relief and a burden. They didn't have to explain what they'd done, but they also couldn't talk about it, couldn't process it, couldn't reconcile it. They carried it alone. In 1993, a military historian researching unconventional weapons of World War II found references to the M10A1 round in declassified Ordnance Department files. He tried to track down veterans who'd used it, found a few. Most refused to talk. One, a former Marine who'd fired WP rounds on Iwo Jima, agreed to an interview but asked not to be named. He described the weapon as the most effective and most terrible thing I ever used. He talked about the tactical advantage, the lives saved, the positions reduced. Then he talked about the nightmares, the guilt, the faces of the men who'd burned. At the end of the interview, he said, "People need to know this happened. I don't know if they'll understand. War makes you do things you can't live with, but you do them anyway because the alternative is worse." The historian included the interview in his book. It was published by a small academic press. Almost nobody read it. The story of the M10A1 remained buried, but the men who fought on Okinawa, those who survived, those who carried the memories, knew. They knew what the white cloud meant. They knew what it cost. And they knew that sometimes in war, the line between hero and monster isn't a line at all. It's a blur, a cloud, white, burning, and impossible to see through. Moss died in 2001 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his military service. U.S. Army, Pacific Theater, Bronze Star recipient, but said nothing about what he'd done to earn it. His children found a box of war memorabilia after he died. Photographs, letters, a faded unit patch, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a single spent bazooka round casing. No markings, no label, just a piece of metal. They didn't know what it meant. They threw it away. The memory died with him. That's how most of these stories end. Not with recognition or understanding, but with silence. The men who did the hardest things, who made the impossible choices, who carried the weight of decisions that saved lives and destroyed souls, fade into history without a trace. We remember the battles. We remember the victories. But we forget the men who made them possible and the cost they paid to do it. The White Phosphorus bazooka rounds fired on Okinawa in the spring of 1945 were never officially acknowledged. They exist in scattered documents, buried in archives, known only to researchers and the few remaining veterans who saw them used. But their impact was undeniable. They broke the Shuri Line. They shattered Japanese morale. They saved American lives. And they left a generation of soldiers haunted by the memory of what they'd done in the name of victory. There's no monument to them, no plaque, no memorial, just the knowledge that war demands terrible things from ordinary men, and that sometimes those men do them and live with the consequences and never speak of it again. That's the legacy of the White Death. Not glory, not pride, just survival and the weight of memory, and the understanding that some victories cost more than can ever be repaid. If you want more untold stories from the hardest battles ever fought, subscribe now